of Research here at the Elliott School. I'm extremely happy to welcome everybody to this wonderful event that is on the topic of Professor Amitai Etzioni's new book, Avoiding War with China. We have an amazing panel here with us today with three very impressive individuals whose collective experience spans more than 4 decades of scholarship and government service, and I would say just plain experience with Asia and with other parts of the world, all over the world, I should add. I'm going to introduce them first, all three of them, and talk a little bit about their enormous experience. And then I will invite Amitai to begin, and I think each of them will speak for about 15 minutes, hopefully to leave some time for questions after they're done as well. So Professor Amitai Etzioni received his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. He served as professor of sociology at Columbia University for 20 years and was a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution before serving as a senior advisor to the White House from 1979 to 1980. In 1980, Professor Etzioni was named university professor and professor of international affairs at the George Washington University here. And he currently serves as director of the Institute for Communitarian Policy Studies. From 1987 to 1989, he served as the Thomas Henry Carroll Ford Foundation professor at the Harvard Business School. Professor Etzioni served as the president of the American Sociological Association between 1994 and 95, and in 1989 to 90, he was the founding president of the International Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics. Professor Etzioni is the author of no less than 24 books, including Security First. Let's see which one I have here. No, that's not it. Security First for Muscular Moral Foreign Policy, and From Empire to Community, a New Approach to International Relations. His latest book is Avoiding War with China, and this is the topic of our discussion today. 2 Nations, One World. Welcome, Professor Etzioni. Ambassador Chas Freeman Jr. is a career diplomat who served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs between 1993 and 94, earning the highest public service awards of the Department of Defense for his roles in designing a NATO-centered post-Cold War European security system and re-establishing defense and military relations with China. He was ambassador to Saudi Arabia between 1989 and 1992 during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He also served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs between 1986 and 89, and as Chargé d'Affaires in Bangkok and Beijing in the 1980s. Between 1979 and 1981, he was the Director for Chinese Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, and he served as the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972. He has been the chair of the Atlantic Council 1996 to 2008, the co-chair of the United States China Policy Foundation, and president of the Middle East Policy Council as well. Ambassador Freeman is currently a senior fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. He's recipient of numerous honors and awards, and the author of a long list of books as well, some of which are The Diplomat's Dictionary, Arts of Power, Statecraft, and Diplomacy, America's Misadventures in the Middle East, that one is from 2010, Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige, published in 2012, and most recently, Americans America's Continuing Misadventures in the Middle East, 2016. I like that one. Finally, Michael Pillsbury received his BA from Stanford University and his PhD from Columbia, where his main advisors were Spid Brzezinski and Michael Oxenberg, both who later played roles in the Jimmy Carter administration on policy towards both China and Afghanistan. During the Reagan administration, Dr. Pillsbury served as the Assistant Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Planning and was responsible for implementation of the program of covert aid known as the Reagan Doctrine. In 1975 to 76, while an analyst at the Rand Corporation, Dr. Pillsbury published articles on foreign policy and international security, recommending that the US establish intelligence and military ties with China, which later became policy during the Carter and Reagan administrations. Dr. Pillsbury served on the staff of 4 US Senate committees from 1978 to 84 and 86 to 91. As a staff member, Dr. Pillsbury drafted the Senate Labor Committee version of the legislation that enacted the US Institute of Peace in 1984. He also assisted in drafting the legislation to create the National Endowment for Democracy and the annual requirement for a DoD report on Chinese military power. In 1992, under George H.W. Bush, Dr. Pillsbury was Special Assistant for Asian Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, reporting to Andrew W. Marshall, Director of NEST Assessment. Dr. Pillsbury is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He is the author of 2 books on China, The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower, and this was published in 2015, and I have it right here. And a second one, China Debates and the Future Security Environment, published in 2000. Those are very impressive bios. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Amitai to take it from here, and then I'll come back for the questions.
Thank you very much, Trevor, for a very generous introduction. And I want to thank Ambassador Freeman and Dr. Pillsbury for taking time, I know from very hectic schedules, to join us. Aside from the audience, a larger audience would benefit from your comments. So that these modern technologies of streaming and all the other good things which I touched on. I also like to recognize Patrick Fine, former National Security Advisor, who joined us, and I hope to hear from him during the discussion. I'm going to make 4 points. One, that I believe there's a reason to be concerned that the United States and China are drifting toward war. 2, that war is hell. 3, that if we look at the objective factors, and I stress the objective factors, there are really very few issues between us and China we could not settle peacefully. And finally, that we need a public debate about our China policy. I believe so far we had more discussions about who can use whose bathroom than about our China policy. About the first point, Steve Bannon stated that the United States is going to be in war with China within 5 to 10 years. John Mearsheimer, a very often cited political scientist, argued that war with China is almost inevitable. There's a large group of historians who argue there is an iron law of history, that when a new power rises and the established power does not yield, that a war will ensue, and that iron law has been in play since Athens and Sparta, it's that long. Anson Graham at Harvard challenged this idea, and he went and looked at 16 instances in which there was guys in new power challenging established power since 1500, and he found that in 12 cases war ensued, but in 4 didn't. So he's the optimist of the lot. He says there's only 75% probability that you get to war in China. Now, unlike some people who write on that subject, I've been to war. And I don't want to draw on my bitter personal experiences, but I'd like you instead to look at just one recent war we have been engaged in Iraq. So far, at least conservatively estimated, 250,000 people have been killed. At least another 750,000 people lost an arm, a leg, and eye, severely wounded as a result of the war. Many other millions have lost their homes and are drifting about. It's 15 years now. The civil war is far from over. The government, which some people discover is democratic, is a Shia government which uses its police and army as death squads against the Sunnis, which drive them to support ISIS. That is one not unusual result of war. If you look at the situation in Afghanistan, in many ways worse. We turned one of the most corrupt nations in the world into the most corrupt nation in the world, and one which it was forbidden to grow opiates, to one of the major suppliers of drugs. It's like a narco-terrorist state, basically. So at least, before to go to another war, we should examine the day after. And what I found particularly missing in some details in the book, I made not all the documents I'm going to classify, but I looked at all the major published documents on how we're going to war China. Evan Friedberg's book on the Battle Plan, the Land Corporation, and quite a few others. And they have all one thing in common. They don't tell us what's going to happen the day after we win. So what are we going to do with China after we win? So some people say we have to follow the Colin Powell rule that if you broke it, you own it. And that's why we stayed in Iraq and Afghanistan to try to make them, I have a hard time saying this a straight face, into liberal democracies. But, are we going to occupy China and try to turn it into a liberal democracy? I mean, I think it's such an absurd notion that it hardly deserves criticism. Are we going to leave the next day and leave them behind the way we left Germany after World War I, humiliated and defeated, and turning into 1.2 billion North Koreans? So one can say there's a division of labor. Some people study war and other people study the day after. So there is the line which we should remember: we tend to win the war and lose the peace. But it's not simple like that. There's some other department which I couldn't find that people study the day after. There's a connection between the two. The way you fight is influenced by what you think should happen the day after. If you think you want to devastate that country, you're going to destroy their infrastructure, etc. If you believe you're going to rebuild it, you may be sparing first. Anyhow, can't separate from my viewpoint what you're after from the way you fight. Now, the good news is, and that may be what I did most in my book, is to ask the question, what are the differences between us and China, which in any way or shape could justify war? I should advise to say, I'm not a pacifist. I can imagine a situation, and it's easy for me to point to a situation, in which despite the tragedy and the misery of war, it can be called for. But before we go there, before we consider it, I think we should look at the objective situation. And there's a long, long list of things in which we have compatible or complementary interests to. The most obvious one, and very much in the headlines today, is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I think most sensible people realize that there's no way we're going to deal with North Korea, probably our most immediate security risk, is without the help of China. But the way we approach it sometimes is to say China ought to do that because to show that they're good people, that they're responsible. The risk and cost to China to push Korea are very serious. They are concerned that millions of Koreans will show up in their country. They are concerned they lose one of the few allies they have. And above all, they're concerned that the United States will move its troops north to the border with China. Well, I don't think it will cost as much to make it clear that we have no reason in the world to move our troops to the border of China if North Korea collapses. Indeed, we may have no particular reason to keep a military presence in Korea at all under those circumstances. And second, China is, from my viewpoint, for good reason, concerned about the anti-missile defense we recently put into South Korea. We keep saying it's only against North Korean missiles and will do nothing to Chinese missiles. Not everybody, even in the West, agrees to that definition. And I emphasize it for 1 minute how important it is. The whole idea of nuclear deterrence is based on the notion that you cannot hit me because you hit me when you hit your back. But if one side puts up an effective anti-missile defense, I cannot hit you back, then I'm a sitting duck. It's an extremely destabilizing move. And again, I see no reason in the world why the United States could not state that if North Korea no longer is a nuclear power, why we would need to anti-defense missiles there. And so there's just one area in which I see good reasons for both sides to collaborate. We're already collaborating on the pollution and climate control issues, which are very important to China and very important to us. They're a major partner in the Paris agreements. They are very concerned with terrorism, and that's an odd little thing here. We tend to think about the Muslim minority in China as a prosecuted minority, which they are. But there's also no denying that they committed a bunch of terrorist acts. So on that issue, on fighting Muslim terrorism, China and us again see the same thing, the situation more or less in the same way. We can talk about piracy, we can talk about a long list of other things about the economy, how economies are extremely intertwined. Now, I got you one thing. So the trick of symbolism, you can turn any small thing into a major problem. So, I mean, just to remind us, right, a flag is a piece of cloth with a stick. So if you look at it, it has no value. You call it a flag, people are willing to die for it. Yes, we can take a pile of rocks with some sand on it and some missiles which are sitting duck in case of a war. They're basically like a maroon aircraft carrier. And make out of this a sign that China is aggressive and so on and so on. A very detailed analysis shows surprisingly little happened. Yes, at one point China put an oil rig 70 miles from Vietnam. Now they took it back. They danced around the Shikoku Islands 5 times. There are still empty islands with some herders and goats in it. So if you scrape the symbolism, my suggestion is there's a lot of room here for negotiation. So what I'm calling for is, I call it the hedge for peace. I would like to see us take a period, not endless, say 2 years, in which you're going to tell China, in this period, we'll stop trying to build military bases all around you. We'll stop pushing Japan to increase its military budget. We'll stop pushing India to build up its military against you. We'll stop twisting Vietnam's arm. We'll stop trying to court everybody, whoever you would try to ally with, Burma, Cambodia, Laos, all line them up. And instead, let's all kind of pause for a moment, you too, you Chinese too, and see if you can use this period to work out our differences peacefully, because we need those hundreds of billions for nation building at home. You need those hundreds of billions for some very challenging issues you face at home. And if we both sink them into an arms race, at best we'll buy things we never use, and at worst they will lead to a horrible war. So that's the public debate I'm calling for, and that's a public debate. My book is How to Do It Engineer. Thank you very much.
I urge everybody to read the book. It's a very rewarding read, and I agree with the 4 points that Dr. Etzioni started out with. I'd simply add, as someone with my own experience in war, that the most important question you should ask before you start a war is how you're going to end it, on what terms. And no one can explain how a US-China war ends, which should give us pause. And let's not kid ourselves. The armed forces of the United States and China are now very far along in planning and practicing how to go to war with each other. Neither has any idea when or why it might have to engage with the other on the battlefield, but both agree on the list of contingencies that could spark conflict. They range from naval scuffles in the Spratly or Senkaku Islands to full-spectrum combat over Taiwan independence or reunification. The context in which these contingencies might occur reflects an imbalance of power left over from history. U.S. forces are forward deployed along China's frontiers in a pattern that originated with the Cold War policy of containment. Chinese forces are deployed to defend China's borders as China defines them. China regards the United States as the country most able and likely to violate those borders and attack it. The United States basically seeks to sustain the military dominance of the Western Pacific that it has enjoyed since its 1945 overthrow of Japanese imperial power. Washington is determined to preclude the contraction of the sphere of influence it established during the Cold War. And China is striving to establish defensible maritime borders to prevent Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam from prevailing in their counterclaims to islands and rocks in its near seas, and to reintegrate Taiwan, which the United States separated from China, the rest of China, and placed in its sphere of influence 67 years ago in 1950. Elements of the U.S. military aggressively patrol the air and seas that abut China. Their purpose is to be ready to strike the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, by striking bases in its homeland if conflict with the U.S. or U.S. allies occurs. Not surprisingly, China objects to these missions. It's steadily strengthening its capacity not just to fend off American attempts to scout or penetrate its defenses, but to recover Taiwan by coercive means. The U.S. Armed Forces and the PLA have met on the battlefield before, but never on Chinese soil. Sino-American wars have taken place only in third countries like Korea, or by proxy and covert action, as in Indochina. But any war between the United States and China under the contingencies both now contemplate would begin in places that China considers part of its territory. It might be possible to limit a conflict in the South China Sea to the islands and waters there. But a Sino-Japanese clash over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, or a Sino-American war over Taiwan would almost certainly entail U.S. strikes on the Chinese mainland. Chinese doctrine calls for such strikes to be answered with reprisals against U.S. bases and the American homeland. China's no first use doctrine is a significant barrier to China's use of nuclear weapons for such reprisal, but one that is easy to imagine being breached under the pressure of wartime crisis conditions. Beijing is likely to see U.S. attacks on Chinese bases where nuclear and conventional weapons are commingled as the equivalent of a strategic first strike designed to knock out China's nuclear deterrent. Any threat that China's Communist Party leadership perceives as existential would stimulate some to argue for nuclear as well as cyber reprisal against comparable facilities in the United States. In the American political elite and officer corps, alarm about the damage a nuclear strike can wreak on its targets and the retaliation it invites has succumbed to nuclear amnesia. The national allergy to the use of nuclear weapons has weakened concomitantly. Washington is again exploring tactical uses for nuclear weapons and funding programs to develop them. Americans have ceased to consider what a nuclear exchange with Russia, China, or another foreign foe would do to the United States. The current hysteria over North Korea may in time correct this. But for now, Americans remain in denial, imagining that, despite all the evidence to the contrary, the U.S. missile defense program will work. No one is preparing for scenarios in which it does not, which I think is more likely than it working. Meanwhile, communication between the American and Chinese national security establishments is far less robust than it was between the U.S. and USSR during the Cold War. There is very little, if any, mutual trust between Beijing and Washington, despite what President Trump and President Xi say. Senior U.S. military officers understand Chinese political military doctrine poorly, or not at all. There are no Sino-American understandings or mechanisms for escalation control. It's past time, but not too late to begin creating these. This is not a reassuring situation, which is one reason that the book is timely. But there are many factors that inhibit rash Chinese actions in response to a crisis. And there's some on the US side too. Neither China nor America wants war with the other. Under the People's Republic, China has established a 7-decade-long record of strategic caution and a preference for diplomatic and non-military or paramilitary rather than military solutions to national security problems. China clearly prefers to use measures short of war to protect itself, but it has also shown that it is fully prepared to go to war to defend its borders and strategic interests. Chinese uses of force have been notably purposive, determined, disciplined, and focused on limited objectives, with no moving of the goalposts. In Korea, where ragtag Chinese forces fought the United States to a standstill from 1950 to 1953, China settled for the de facto restoration of the status quo ante bellum, the condition before the war, strategic denial of the northern half of the Korean peninsula to hostile forces. In 1958, it ended its military presence in Korea entirely. When border skirmishes escalated into war between China and India in 1962, China first showed India that, if provoked, the PLA could overrun it. Then, having made that point, China withdrew its troops to their original positions. In the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War, China accepted huge losses on the battlefield to teach Vietnam that the costs of continued empire building in association with the Soviet Union would be unacceptably high. Once Vietnam seemed convinced, China disengaged its forces. China waited a decade to respond to multiple seizures of disputed islands and reefs in the South China Sea by other claimants. The Philippines began the process of creating facts in the sea in 1978. Vietnam followed in 1982, and Malaysia did the same in 1983. In 1988, China intervened to halt the further expansion of Vietnamese holdings. Since then, China has established an unejectable presence of its own on 7 artificially enlarged land features in the South China Sea. It has not attempted to dislodge other claimants from any of the 4 dozen outposts they have planted in Chinese-claimed territories. China's been careful not to provoke military confrontations with them, the other claimants, or with the U.S. Navy, despite the latter's sometimes swaggering assertiveness. A similar pattern of restraint has been evident in the Senkaku, or Diaoyutao, which China considers to be part of Taiwan, and Japan asserts are part of Okinawa. There, China seeks to present an active challenge to Japanese efforts to foreclose discussion of the two sides' dispute over sovereignty. It's done so with lightly armed Coast Guard vessels rather than with the PLA's naval warfare arm. Japan has been equally cautious. China negotiated the reunification of both Hong Kong and Macau, although it could have used force, as India did in Goa, to achieve reintegration. China's negotiated generous settlements and demarcations of its land borders with Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Nepal, Pakistan, Russia, Tajikistan, and Vietnam. China's borders with the former British Empire in Bhutan, India, and Myanmar remain unsettled formally, but for the most part, peaceful. These interactions between China and its neighbors demonstrate a high degree of Chinese competence at managing differences without armed conflict. They provide grounds for optimism. War, including accidental war, between China and its neighbors, or China and the United States as the ally of some of those neighbors, is far from inevitable. China's been cautious, even with respect to Taiwan, that most chauvinist of all issues. There has been no exchange of fire between the Civil War rivals on opposite sides of the Taiwan Strait since 1979. On January 1 of that year, the United States accepted Beijing as China's capital and ceased its formal championship of Taipei in that role. Beijing responded by discontinuing its advocacy of forceful liberation of Taiwan and announcing a policy aimed at peaceful reunification. So far, despite occasional provocations from pro-independence forces in Taiwan, China has stuck with this policy, placing equal emphasis on enticement and intimidation. Beijing's United Front outreach to Taiwanese complements the military pressure, its growing capacity to devastate the island imparts to the imperative of cross-strait accommodation. The bottom line is that while Chinese warnings must clearly be taken seriously, Chinese aggressiveness should not be overestimated. China tends to act militarily with prudence upon warning, not rashly. Its wealth and power are growing, giving it an incentive to defer confrontations to the future, when its relative strength will be greater and new opportunities to win without fighting may arise. The record shows that China adheres to limited objectives, limited means, and limited timescales. On the other hand, it is characteristically determined once the die is cast to invest whatever level of effort is required to achieve its objectives. China has been notably careful to avoid mission creep in the wake of success. There is no evidence that its ambitions are open-ended or unbridled. If given an inch, it's unlikely to seek to take a mile. So what's the problem? Why are we concerned about how to avoid war with China? There are two reasons, one short-term and one long-term. The first relates to Taiwan, which the United States has pledged to defend. The island is now ruled by an anti-reunification, pro-independence government. Trump administration statements have raised doubts about whether Washington might upgrade relations with Taipei, relitigate the U.S. commitment to a one-China policy, or otherwise change direction on this most neuralgic of all issues for Chinese nationalism. China now has the military means to bring Taiwan to heel, despite U.S. opposition. The uncertainties injected by Mr. Trump's tweets seem to have moved Beijing to consider whether to act before the issue goes off track. It is entirely possible that once this fall's 19th Party Congress has passed, arguments for resolving the question of Taiwan's relationship to the rest of China by the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 2021 will gain force. If so, the long-deferred bloody rendezvous of the United States with Chinese nationalism could be upon us as Beijing makes Taipei an offer it cannot refuse. Americans will then have to decide how invested we are in our Cold War commitment to keep China divided. In the longer term, while Washington persists in proceeding on the assumption that the United States can forever dominate China's periphery, this notion has steadily diminishing credibility in Asia. America's power is visibly declining, not just in relation to China, but also the increasingly self-reliant allies and friends of the United States in the region. These trends give every sign of accelerating. They reflect underlying realities that increased U.S. defense spending cannot alter or reverse. Sino-American rivalry, political, economic, and military, therefore, seems destined to intensify. China can and will easily match budget plus-ups by the United States. Despite much shadow boxing by the U.S. Armed Forces, American military primacy in the Western Pacific will gradually waste away. Both the costs of U.S. trans-Pacific engagement and the risks of armed conflict will rise. The states of the region will hedge. They will either draw closer to Beijing, cleave to Washington, or more likely, try to get out of the middle between Chinese and Americans. For the most part, they will not repudiate their alliances with the United States. Why give up something for nothing? But they will rely less on the United States and act more independently of it. So the central question in whether the United States can avoid war with China comes down to this. How much damage to our homeland are we prepared to risk to pursue specific foreign policy objectives that antagonize China? In the 21st century, when Americans kill faraway people, faraway foreigners, we must expect that they will retaliate, and that one way or another, we will pay a price in civilian as well as military deaths for our actions. It's time to get serious. We Americans are not omnipotent, nor are we invulnerable, but we are a people who value honor. In the case of China and its neighbors, how do we balance our interests with our honor?
May I begin by taking a minute to nostalgically remember going to a packed course at Columbia University 50 years ago, almost to the day, taught by Professor Amitai Etzioni. And in many ways, the content of the course previewed Graham Allison's very famous book, Essence of Decision, especially about organizational errors in understanding the environment they were in. A Nobel Prize went to Herb Simon after you taught your course for some similar thinking on bounded rationality, limited rationality. Also, a Nobel Prize went to one of the team of Tversky and Kahneman, famous for their book titled Thinking Fast and Slow. You attracted a filled room of 300 graduate students, in part because of focusing on what you want to have a debate on now. Can organizations make errors? And in fact, you argued that the probability is quite high, approaching 100%. Chas Freeman's book titles, when he uses the word misadventures, these are in some ways what you taught us 50 years ago. These are organizations making errors, not in some evil way, but because of the way organizations and humans in them behave. Also, the women were very attracted to you because the word had gone out that you were a hero in the Palmach, and you were in some sense competitive with the Haganah and the Irgun in a commando raid to take out a British radar that was observing what the movie would call the Exodus. And the British, however, were quite crafty, and they shot in the head the leader of your team. So this made the men in the audience want to be like you someday, and the women all want to marry you. It was a great course, and it influenced me, and I think lots of others. Today, I agree with you. There should be a debate on avoiding war with China. If you're Bud McFarlane and you wrote a book called Special Trust a long time ago, and your quite aware of Ronald Reagan's 4 national security decision directives on China, and you wake up 30 years later, you'll be shocked. China was almost our best friend in the world at that time. President Reagan approved the sale of 6 weapon systems to China. We had intensive intelligence cooperation, including the most sensitive that we don't do with really almost any other country in the world, covert action cooperation. So if you fast forward from when Bud McFarlane was in charge to today, you'll be quite shocked, because I brought with me, I think there may be others, but there are quite a few books now by generalists on a war with China and how to avoid it. The Next Great War, a series of essays about lessons learned from World War I and stumbling into conflict. As Ambassador Freeman sort of mentioned, accidental war, no one deliberately wants to provoke at the time. Peter Navarro, a few blocks away, assistant to the president, has done 2 books on war with China in an online film in which he interviews about 20 scholars, asking them what kind of war is coming with China, what do you think will happen. This one, The Improbable War, Chris Coker in London, I was with him about 2 or 3 weeks ago at a conference. He makes a very strong case that we're moving, as you use the word, Professor, drifting. We're drifting toward war with China without a conscious debate. And it's really think tanks and professors who are dramatizing this subject, not government officials. And I'm sort of proud, even though I'm a Republican and I'm seated to your right, to have worked a lot for the Obama administration in the Pentagon. And part of your debate is you allege that sort of secret forces, at one time you called it subterranean forces, have brought this about. And you focus on the office I've been most closely associated with for almost 40 years, net assessment. And you say something in the book, in several of the chapters. I won't say you demonize this, but you imply that there's this subterranean force located in this one little teeny office in the Pentagon, and it is operating in great secrecy, moving the country toward war with China. But your sources are really suspect. They're think tanks that are paid by net assessment, perhaps to inflate the status of the office, or they're professors associated with the office somehow or other. So in the debate that I hope everybody will buy your book and have such a debate, I think one issue that I would disagree with you on is why the drift toward war with China. Is it really anti-Marshall and this small office in the Pentagon, or is there something China has been doing to bring about this drift? And you have a chapter where you pretty much exonerate China. You say that they are falsely called aggressive. And of course, President Obama has used that term, as has the Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, used the word aggressive about China. And you say this is unfair, that aggression usually means conquest across borders. China hasn't done that, and Ambassador Freeman pointed out in the case of India in '62, they sort of make a psychological point and then pull back. This is the same view, which I think is correct, that Henry Kissinger lays out in his book on China, of the psychological use of force, as opposed to a Tojo or a Stalin or a Hitler who's trying to conquer territory and then keep it. So, in my view, net assessment may be innocent, there may be other factors. The drift may be China's fault more than America's fault. Not that studying this after the war will make any difference to anybody. People will assess what was the path. There's a book called The Path to Pearl Harbor, for example. Then you have a quite fascinating section. It appears in several different chapters. Concrete, specific ideas for an accommodation or a kind of testing that in some sense, since you claim both sides do not have any serious issues in conflict, certainly not territorial issues. So that why not try a accommodation. And Ambassador Freeman makes the point that there's a kind of architecture that we had with the Soviet Union, especially including arms control talks, that we simply do not have with China. There's some military exchange programs date back, but the Ambassador Freeman determines, I think is correct, that a mechanism does not exist. So we don't have arms control talks. We don't have a real feel between the two sides, I don't think, about the military balance of power. We each sort of read the other's views on the military balance. They seem, in some books and conversations, to be overconfident. They have ways of expressing what happened in 1950-51 as a great victory for China, sort of the opposite of the American characterization. They have strange ways, from my point of view anyway, of talking about the nuclear balance. They also have a kind of paranoia about the United States in outer space and in cyber. A series of books have come out now where they claim we are, and this is related to South Korea, and they frequently claim, they the PLA authors, I read, that America has a kind of conspiratorial desire for absolute superiority, absolute military superiority. I think we heard this at least 20 years ago. 绝对优势. And when we do something like the X-37 experimental Air Force program in space that has classified aspects to it, the Chinese immediately talk about this. Aha, this is the American plan for a first strike in space and on the ground. Similar comments are made about cyber. So the Chinese seem to have talked themselves into the notion that they are on the defensive against a very aggressive and dangerous hegemon who, as I try to bring out from some of their writings, who is trying to defend itself as it declines in overall power. So that the 50-year picture, or even the 100-year picture, Chinese seem to see is the Americans are not going quietly to their assigned historic role to be number 2 or even number 3 in comprehensive national power. The Americans are dangerous because they're trying to resist this inevitable trend. And this leads to something else that you touch on in the book, I think, which is one reason I'm so enthusiastic about it. Everyone should buy this book. And frankly, it should be translated into Korean, Chinese, even Hindi. I was very lucky. I've been translated in 5 languages now. And your sales can be even greater overseas if they're my book was number 2 in Japan. Who knew? So the nations that border China tend to be more concerned and want more of a debate to understand what the Americans are up to. But the debate, to me, I would list maybe 4 issues in the debate triggered by the book. The first is the chances of war. I think the low figure I've heard is 0 or 10%. Elliot Cohen has a new book called The Big Stick. He's been saying 10% chance of a U.S.-American war of any kind. You've got some 25% people in public now saying that. You've got Graham Allison quite recently saying 75%. And as you correctly point out, John Mearsheimer, for structural reasons related to his international relations theory, he's at 100%. As you quoted Steve Bannon, if he really means that sentence that he's quoted saying, he's also 100% kind of person. I think Peter Navarro in his work is certainly very high. I don't know if he'd go for 100%. That's issue 1. Issue 2 is the military balance. Is it declining from the American point of view, and therefore are there legitimate, reasonable, non-provocative things to do, like the so-called B-3 long-range strike bomber? Air Force spokesmen justify that bomber as both the future of the U.S. Air Force and also to deal with the changing balance in Asia. There are other positions. The new RAND Corporation study I brought also online in a very mechanical way goes through 10 what they call scorecards of the military balance. In all 10, the American position is declining. So this is a warning from RAND if you don't do something, if you, the DoD, don't do something about these 10 balances, you'll face the consequences in terms of the weakening of deterrence. Now, this would be the opposite of what I take from your proposals, that a huge American buildup, new weapon systems, is the opposite of what should be done. Third issue in the debate, seems to me, is our arms sales to our allies and partners. We became the number 2, and at some points, the number 1 arms salesman to India, the country of Gandhi, in some sense, pacifism. Now they can patrol with American aircraft with torpedoes and anti-ship missiles in the back, the Indian Ocean, flying over Chinese ships. Similar arms sales have been made to other neighbors of China. They clearly see this as a provocative thing in Beijing. But from our point of view, how can we turn down allies who feel, despite their poverty in the case of India, the need to buy weapons essentially against China? That strikes me as part of the debate. Fourth, you assert that the driving force, besides net assessment, the driving force is American defense contractors who want to sell very expensive weapon systems to the Pentagon, not relatively cheap anti-terrorist equipment, but things like the long-range strike bomber, which, according to some professors, is possibly $500 million a plane. And the Air Force at one point said it needed 100 of them or more. So this strikes me the role of American corporations, the defense budget, what to do about the balance. This is a part of the debate I think you want to stimulate. And finally, you raise, without quite saying it, you raise the issue of deception being conducted by both the American government and the Chinese government. With the American government, you're very clear that even though I heard Kurt Campbell as Assistant Secretary say many times, the pivot is not about China. That was the official comment by the Defense Department as well. However, the credibility of this is not high in China or in the rest of Asia. On the Chinese side, as I try to document in my last 3 or 4 pages, they are very sensitive about being accused of seeking hegemony or using force for conquest. And I sort of agree with Zhou Nai and Li Guanyu, that something dangerous the U.S. can do that it should not is to exaggerate Chinese power. It's one thing to say, as I do, in 2049, China will be double or triple the U.S. economy under certain assumptions. It's something else, again, to imply that in the next few years or already, China has very strong military forces that we should be afraid of. So I oppose that, and in a debate, it seems to be that's part of the military balance debate, is how strong really is China. And we have one extreme, Gordon Chang, the coming collapse of China, this kind of view. We have the other side that a couple of Chinese economists have taken, Hu Angong and Justin Lin Fu, that the Chinese economy actually we should be bullish about the Chinese economy. It's not going to collapse. This is not going to be the end of the China challenge. So in sum, it seems to me, let's get some foreign publishing houses to translate your book. Let's get the left and the right to focus on the issues in debate. And let's reactivate the way those Columbia men and women students related to you 50 years ago and see you as the person bringing this matter to public attention, along with the other books that have done so. But you have a fresh perspective, I thought. Thank you.
Will you allow me 1 minute to clarify something before we...
Absolutely.
I'm not going to argue with you because you simply agree. And I'm certainly not going to argue with you because just made not my week, not my day, my year, my God. I mean, and how you remember things which happened 50 years ago, it's just beyond my comprehension. And
I took notes.
if you can find your notes from 50 years ago, it's even more impressive. We have Charlie Glazer, Robert Daly, and other good people in the room, so I want to take just 1 minute to clarify one thing. And that is Andy Marshall in your tiny office. Again, you can read other people what they said about the influence of Marshall. But my point really is that the Pentagon, including Marshall's office, did the right thing. It's their job to scrutinize the horizon, see if they can see any signs of danger, and suggest to the White House a way to prepare to deal with the danger. My argument is that the White House failed because the way it's supposed to be, as the study, the DoD comes to the White House and says, Mr. President, the Security Council, we think there is a challenge here. We think we need to do this X, Y, Z. Then the White House says, State Department, what say you? Intelligence community, what say you? We have a discussion, actually sometimes, of course, several, and then the President makes a decision. What I did not find in the Obama administration is any discussion, any of the RC battle. Secretary of Defense signed off on it without including the book by the gentleman who was in charge of China in the White House under Obama. Jeff Bennett at the moment, I think it's the right name. There is no discussion of the RC battle. On the contrary, there's discussion of all kinds of very different, much more less confrontational policies. So that's, I just want to be sure that I have nothing against you.
You exonerate that assessment to Andy Marshall.
And
it's really the State Department.
And you're all in it.
You blame
and you're all in that office. So I just want to clear that up. And last sentence, China, it's not my definition of aggression. It's the United Nations definition of aggression. China did not act in any way I can find which violates the United Nations definition of aggression. And the best line I close on that is by Aaron Friedberg, who is after all on the other side, who said, so far, not a single shot has been fired and not one person has been killed. I wish other nations would not be more aggressive than China.
All right, we're going to go to questions. I know that we're at 1 o'clock and the event was advertised between 12 and 1, so if you feel like you need to leave, feel free. But we're going to do another 10-15 minutes, hopefully. We have a first question over here. Before you go, please, there's a microphone right here. Please identify yourselves and please try to be brief and do pose a question.
Hi, my name is Gerrit Vanderwees from the Netherlands. I was a next door neighbor to you a long time ago. I had a comment and a question. The comment is actually to Charles Freeman. Taiwan was not separated from China 67 years ago, as it wasn't part of China in the first place. It had been a Japanese colony and then was occupied by Chiang Kai-shek, as we all know. But now Taiwan is a free and democratic country, and they don't want to be occupied once again. So I think that's an important point to what you said. To Professor Etzioni, I wanted to ask you, if you have broached your questions in Beijing, and if so, what was the reaction? I think many of these points are quite important to discuss about, and we are discussing them here in the United States, but can they even be discussed in China? I think I would agree with Mike Pillsbury that it is the Chinese expansionism vis-a-vis its neighbors, including Taiwan, that's really the main problem here.
Can I collect a few more questions before we respond? Because we have a lot. Yes, one over here and then over here. So let's do 3.
We get Bob Digley had his hand up. He's back in the back row. He's very shy.
Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. Professor Etzioni, I want to congratulate you on your book. I've only gotten half through it yet, but I'm very happy with it. And I think it's a very important debate that's starting here. One thing that I'm missing is that we're in a situation, there is a way out of this problem, and the way out has been presented by China in what is known as the Belt and Road Project. This is something that has changed the geometry of world politics forever. You have now in Africa, Latin America, a great deal of optimism and excitement about the possibilities of development and possibilities of cooperation between nations, the like of which we haven't seen. The United States has been invited to be a part of this. Most recently, the Chinese ambassador to the United States has said very explicitly that they would like the United States to be a part of the Belt and Road. This is a project that represents the common aims of mankind and the common aims of the United States, because the infrastructural development that's going on around the Belt and Road could be very beneficial to reviving the U.S. economy. And I'm hopeful that President Trump, at a certain point, will understand this in creating the type of relationship where the two most important countries in the world can work together to begin to build infrastructure for mankind. It seems to me that this potential that exists will take us out of the world of geopolitics, where many of these other problems on trade, on whatever we have with China, will pale in connection with what the Belt and Road can bring to the benefit of the United States population, the world population. I think
there are strong reasons to
something.
oppose
Yeah.
the Belt and Road, by the way. He's only giving one side,
But-
so it's a very unfair question.
So is there a
Strong
question?
reasons the American
Yeah.
government should oppose
question,
one Belt, one
Yeah,
Road.
okay, thank you.
Hi, Songwei China Daily. Yeah. So I think this is the best panel on, of thinker in China-US relations in a while. So, I mean, I think, Professor Etzioni, you mentioned a book that you disagree with the fact that the military complex, conspiring Arlington, maybe, how to, start a war with China. Mike also mentioned the military-industrial complex. But to me, there is really a sort of a conspiracy by the military-industrial complex trying to, mention, because if there was a peace, there was no threat of China, there is they cannot get funding, obviously. I visited the Camp Smith back in the early 90s. There was already talk about threat of China. So, a lot of people talk about how the Navy and Air Force try to, cook up with this China threat thing, so otherwise they don't get any money. So is that, I know Ambassador Freeman and Michael both working at DOD, so is that something real?
Let's do one more question over here, and then we get some responses, and then we can do another round.
Thank you, all three of you, for a very rich conversation. You see, nobody would dream of leaving just because the clock had run out, looking for more. Despite all of the descriptions you give of the very pressing long-term and strategic issues, right now the administration seems to be focused on a short-term transactional approach and a highly personalized transactional approach at that, to making deals on what seem to be secondary issues in light of the problems that you've described. If we do continue to take a transactional approach, does this give China a chance to extend its period of strategic opportunity and distract America from the strategic issues to our detriment? Or does this perhaps help the two sides to build trust and to sort of muddle our way toward a more peaceful approach to these problems? I'd like to hear your views on a transactional as opposed to a strategic approach to U.S.-China relations. Thank you.
Go ahead.
On the question of Taiwan, here's the history. 1682, Taiwan was conquered by the Qing from Zhang Chenggong's grandson. 1684, it was incorporated into Fujian province. In the 1880s, following a French attempted annexation of it, it became a province in its own right. In 1895, Japan forced China to cede it to Japan in the Treaty of Shimonoseki. In 1945, following the Cairo and Potsdam agreements, it was returned to China. In 1950, January 1, the United States sent an all-diplomatic cable stating our expectation that it would soon fall to Mao Zedong's victorious forces, and that we did not object. On June 27, 1950, following the North Korean invasion of South Korea, we interposed the 7th Fleet and separated Taiwan from the mainland. There are many people in Taiwan who would prefer to be independent. That's correct. When in my review of history, I don't find any real instance where an independence movement against a motherland succeeds without a war. So that is exactly what we're talking about here. On the subject of One Belt, One Road, this is an economic, in many ways, this is an economic initiative by China that flanks the military pivot by the United States. It basically makes it irrelevant. Over the long run, if this project or plan, concept, comes off, all of Eurasia from Portugal from Lisbon to Vladivostok, from Moscow to Colombo, will be interconnected. And China, as the largest and most dynamic society in this space, will play a leading role. But it is not a military maneuver, and it is not an exercise at dominance. Every single project that is being discussed on an equal basis between various partners, not all of whom are Chinese. Some of the work is being done by Japanese, some by Indians, some by Russians, some by Germans, and so forth. And so if your answer to this is military, I think you're making a big mistake. Finally, I will not talk about the military-industrial complex because I'm not part of it, and therefore I don't entirely understand it.
Thank you. I think all the questions have a common thread, which, including the transactional approach versus other approaches, which is the difficulty of understanding what is American government strategy toward China. President Obama actually did not put forward a China strategy in one long speech with all the aspects of it. And you mentioned Jeff Bader's book, which is really the first year, first 18 months or so, including the Copenhagen encounter. So what the Obama administration did, let's say we're all advising President Trump. He's called in you, me, and Ambassador Freeman, and he asked a very simple question. What did Obama do about China? Can you give me a quick summary? I would maintain it's pretty hard to give a quick summary. There are many conflicting directions. Whether the pivot is going to last or not depends on what the pivot actually was. The more conservative think tanks in Washington unanimously attacked the pivot and rebalanced with one word: hollow, hollow, not enough. At the same time, China is reacting extremely to it. So a related question, a thread in all the questions, is what will President Trump do? Suppose we understood what President Obama did, then should he continue it? Should he make some changes? And it seems to me President Trump has surprised everybody who were his critics in what President Trump himself has called the bonding, the good chemistry, the relationship that was formed. He's praised President Xi now as widely respected or well respected throughout the world. This is quite dramatic, and I don't see it as transactional. However, it is based on President Xi delivering North Korea. In his tweets and his public interviews, President Trump has made this very clear, even to the point of being willing to compromise on trade terms of a new trade arrangement if progress is made on North Korea. So my own advice as a Hudson Institute research fellow is that we ought to have a well thought out and publicly defended China strategy. This was an error President Obama made. He gave parts of it when he was in Tokyo, and he underlined Article 5 of our treaty with you ensures the protection of the Senkakus. This puzzled the Chinese. Why in a speech in Tokyo would he bring up potential war with China? And I remember a delegation, Ambassador Freeman, we had a delegation of several PLA journals coming right after that. And they used a phrase I had never heard before. I read China Daily every day. I'm a subscriber to China Daily. But I'd never seen this sentence. The PLA generals said, "We don't want war with America, but," and they would continue with a series of warnings. So that, it seems to me, establishes your main point here about the need for a debate. Are we drifting toward war with China? If so, what can be done to head it off? But I am simply stymied in how the American government is going to explain itself in terms of your allegations that these subterranean forces, as your first chapter is called, who authorized war with China? If this really has happened, that's a debate. But I think you're weak on sources where a government official actually says this. You're really quoting think tanks and professors, and you're vulnerable in the debate of being called a conspiracy theorist. So that's what Chung Wei-Hua is sort of offering you. He could do a huge front page story. Buy this book, Avoiding War with China. He could quote Ambassador Freeman and me and 10 others, and a picture of the book cover. But only if he accepts this notion that I did not see the Obama administration openly say, we are preparing for a war with China and it's a good thing.
I'll make it very brief. Right? So as to the question, because give time at least for one more questions. As to the question, can I say those things in China? I was the keynote speaker in the 2015 China Forum, in which I said exactly the same things. More important, a group of Chinese academics that connected with many of them out to the government, and a group of Americans met several times, and we issued a joint statement called Mutually Assured Restraint, in which we call on both governments to act and restrain. And so, yes, we can have that conversation. I've been called many things in my life. Conspiracy theories is a new one. I will not admit to that one. I think, as you said, the Obama administration did not articulate a China policy. The DOD did. And so it's not a conspiracy to say that the White House and the Obama administration didn't do their job. It allowed one agency to advance a policy, which is its job. And you're right, that Jeff Bader covered only the first period, but there are 4 other studies all come to the same conclusion. And I think so far, it's very early in the day, the Trump White House didn't do a comprehensive study of a China policy either, as far as one can go. Now, as to the question of the role in the One Belt, there are 2 views of this. One, it's a very major project. Many other people think it's much less than meets the eye. It's a any question how much China is really investing in it. That's a whole other conversation. But most important, many of these things are surprisingly self-curing. If you go in and read any of the reports of the countries in which China is investing, you see that the same thing happened to other colonial powers. And the natives very quickly don't like it. They don't like cheap Chinese labor. They don't like the way their people are treated. They don't like their clannish and snub. So I'm not losing a lot of sleep on China building here and there everywhere. As to the transaction of the daily question, I think here is an observation which we didn't have a chance to make yet. I look at the international environment as extremely hostile, extremely challenging, much more than domestic in the West. It looks more like Iraq inside. And what I mean by that is that it's full of challenges and threats. And therefore, to deal with that by looking at a good world, a peaceful world, is unfortunately a dangerous illusion. So I think what we must do is prioritize and ask ourselves, where's the number 1 threat? Where's the number 2 threat? And focus on those, because you may never get to number 3. So if you keep this, just allow me this for 1 minute, I believe many people will agree that for the next 2 years, the number 1 threat is North Korea nuclear weapon missiles. Therefore, I don't care if you call it transactional or whatever you call it, we need to work with China to solve that problem. I agree that that's going to have, if it works, additional side benefits for dealing with the long arms. But I'm sorry, I cannot lose sleep about those piles of rocks and whatever they put on them compared to North Korea. A number two concern is the following. We may defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but it's percolating in 40 countries. In each case, we send about 40 special forces to fight them. And they are conservatively estimated 100 million young Muslims who are going to be educated and unemployed in the next years. Now, I want to be very clear about it. I'm not saying for a suggestion that every Muslim, every second Muslim will turn into a terrorist. I say 5% of the will. 5% of 100 million is a lot of people. So our second concern is radical Islamic terrorism. I don't think we can begin to get to the other stuff. And that goes back to the question of the balance of what we are buying. I think I'm correct in saying that you're buying a lot of F-35s and not as many A-10s, which are more suitable to fight a terrorist. I think you buy more nuclear submarines. I think you buy more destroyers. These are high-ticket items, which, yes, they have a higher profit margin than anchor mates, but they're not, in my judgment, putting enough resources in fighting terrorism. But that's a second issue. The main issue is a house on fire. I think, I'm talking about North Korea, I'm talking about Islamic terrorism. I don't think it's the time to ask about table manners or where should the couch be set. That's where we need to focus on.
May I praise your book one more way, very briefly, like 30 seconds. I forgot to mention in the last chapter, you raised the issue you just mentioned of cooperation with China against terrorism and in other ways. In our national debate on China, I think there are some people who believe elements of conflict and competitiveness outweigh elements of cooperation. I tend to be on the other side. I think the elements of cooperation with China in the future outweigh the elements of conflict and antagonism. But you bring that out by listing some of the ways the US and China could cooperate in the future. And I thought that was another strong point of the book and a part of what the debate you want to trigger is about. How can we cooperate with China, perhaps even as we try to improve our military balance and prepare for war? Can't we also cooperate much more with China than we have in the past?
I think we are in a world in which broad relations, you're with us or you're against us, are damaging or irrelevant. We are in a world in which limited partnerships and limited enmities prevail. And even if we are competitive or against each other in some contexts with another country, we can cooperate. And that, I would say, actually is a better description of the 1980s US-China relationship than to say that China was almost our best friend. That was a relationship that was very limited to specific purposes for a specific period. And I think that is the model that diplomacy now has to follow. We should not demonize anyone, nor should we glorify them. We should be prepared to work pragmatically together on the specific issues that will otherwise lead us into trouble.
Okay, we're going to take another round of very quick questions. Let me repeat, please be very brief and identify yourself. So 3 or 4 questions and then some quick answers. We've got this gentleman in gray first, and then you number 2. Any more in the back that I can identify?
I think Greg had a question.
Greg's got one.
Thank you, Chaz and Amitai. Mike, very, very rich exchange, and I look forward to finishing the book, Amitai. There seems to have been a very clear evolution in China's going out period that they're now in, from an early start that one could have described as rather mercantilist, and some would say signaling imperial ambition. And yet, for the past 10 years, I have tended to focus on energy. And in co-sponsoring home and home annual gatherings of the Chinese think tanks, China is quite conscious of its vulnerability energy-wise. Today, hydrocarbons are pivotal to China's continued growth. They're making 22 million automobiles or more every year, and you need to power that somehow. China in the One Belt One Road is sponsoring a giant cooperative knitting together of the world with a grid, a super grid that would connect ultimately the United States with the rest of the world. At a cost of about 51 trillion. Well, my point is that it seems to me that in this latter round, when you talked about cooperation, areas for cooperation, that energy is one very much in order. Transportation fuel, notably, the United States has this windfall blessing of natural gas, and China itself, in analyzing what is the best fuel in the world, if you could only find some, concluded it's methanol. Well, the best way to make that is natural gas. It's cheap, easy. And if you do it from the West Coast, it's very cheap. China's not doing that yet. But it seems certainly to be something that ought to be on the agenda, the energy cooperation. If you'd comment, please, on China's energy vulnerability, which is evident. Is that an area for cooperation? If so, why hasn't it begun already?
Hi, my name is Dong Guiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And Mike, you have touched a little bit about President Trump's approach to China. But I'm wondering if President Trump eventually finds that Xi Jinping is not so helpful on the North Korea, what will he do? Will he make another phone call with Tsai Ing-wen or do something like that, or use the Taiwan as a bargaining chip to punish China or something like that? What do you think about that? Thank you.
We've got two more questions. This one over here, and then Greg as well.
Hi, I'm Monica with the Mandarin Service, Voice America. So my question is related to the previous one. It's about North Korea. It's a priority for U.S.-China. It's also one of the areas that the two countries can cooperate. But there's another discussion about if there's no way to solve North Korean missile problem, will the U.S. strike first? And if the U.S. strike first, will China, send troops to North Korea? So is there another scenario for the war between U.S. and China?
And then Greg, our last question.
I'm Greg Brzezinski. I'm a professor of history here in the Elliott School, and I work on Chinese Cold War foreign policy. And I was just curious, we've sort of spoken about two options. One seems to be war, and the other is cooperation. But what about continued competition? I think competition between the US and China, as I've actually recently written, has had a lot of negative ramifications, not only for the United States and China, but also for the rest of the world. So I was wondering if you might talk about what seems most likely to me, which is neither war nor cooperation, but ongoing competition across a wide variety of spectrums, including economic, cultural, and strategic.
Go ahead.
On energy, I think President Xi Jinping agrees with you, which is why he stopped in Alaska to talk to the governor about Alaskan natural gas on his way between China and the United States. The vulnerabilities of China in the energy area are very well known, which is one reason that China has pursued a policy of diversification. Pipelines on land, some very impressive, for example, extending to Turkmenistan, which is very far away, shipping routes, facilities ashore to protect those, and attempts at long-term contracts. If I could come in on North Korea just briefly, I think we need to remember that China fought a very bloody war and sacrificed perhaps 1 million men to establish strategic denial of half of the Korean peninsula. It would prefer the entire peninsula be denied to any hostile power. And I don't think that anything the Chinese do with respect to North Korea is going to violate their interest in strategic denial. So we come back to something that Amitai mentioned in his remarks, if I understood him correctly, and that is that in the end, the United States is probably not going to be in Korea. If there is unified Korea, which Koreans want, which is of no concern particularly to China, which has had several millennia of experience in dealing with Koreans, then if the United States is not there, that is something that benefits China. And if we're not prepared to deal on that subject, we're not going to get anywhere. Whether Mr. Trump, if he's frustrated because the word deliver North Korea was used by someone earlier, I don't think China can deliver North Korea. I think that is a false premise, and it ends up in frustration. What China and the United States can do, and what I think China wants to do, it's not entirely clear what Mr. Trump's strategy is remove Korea as a threat to the region and as a source of potential conflict between the United States and China. You can imagine scenarios in which the United States and China get into a war over North Korea. For example, competing special forces trying to mop up loose nuclear weapons in North Korea under some circumstances, ending up in a fight over those weapons. But generally speaking, that is not a place where the US and China have any fundamental conflict. And the question there then is how to find a basis for working on common interests, which include, I think, removal of the threat of war in Korea, number one, and second, the removal of nuclear weapons, which are a consequence of the threat of war. Final comment, I think there is very poor understanding of this issue in the United States. I just read an otherwise really rather good article which made the preposterous statement that inasmuch as North Korea has the ability to destroy Seoul and has chemical weapons it can deliver on South Korea, it has no requirement for nuclear weapons. But from the North Korean perspective, the United States is the main threat. And if it cannot hit the United States, either at its bases in Japan or in Korea, or the homeland of the United States, it is not able to deter Americans. So somehow, at some point, we are going to have to deal with the actual perceptions, misperceptions perhaps, but the perceptions that North Koreans have that drive them. And we're also going to have to deal with Chinese perceptions or misperceptions as they affect the long-term prospects for a united Korea. And I think the world we face is one in which, indeed, competition will continue even as cooperation also occurs. This is normal. What is abnormal is the situation in the Cold War, in which you are entirely against someone or entirely for them. This is a very rare condition in history, and it will not be replicated, in my view.
Last word.
Well, my role here today isn't to answer questions about Mr. Trump. I'm an admirer of his and a supporter. and I think he's done an excellent job on China so far. My role today is to promote Professor Etzioni's 24th book, because he's raising some fundamental issues, which it seems to me to understand President Trump going forward in the next year or two. This kind of book is almost a guide to what are the issues that a future president has to address. One is the force structure and acquisitions of new weapons of the Pentagon. One is whether the 4 new channels that have been created in the Mar-a-Lago summit, are those 4 channels enough? According to the press coverage at Mar-a-Lago, the 4 channels idea that will replace the SNED is a Chinese initiative. The American side accepted. The 4 channels hold out the prospect of cooperation, including on energy. Also cultural exchanges, Liu Yandong's effort to bring mutual understanding through cultural exchanges. That's one of the 4 channels. So we already have a new approach to China by President Trump. But it seems to me the issues you raise in your book, in each chapter, they ought to be answered by a future president. Obama, as I understand it, did not accept One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, as China Daily calls it now. Obama did not accept President Xi's initiative, which he made clear was very important to him, of the new model of great power relations. So that means in the past 8 years, 2 major initiatives by President Xi were essentially turned down by the Obama administration. They were polite about it. They would always say, we need to explore this further. They never directly rejected it, but they didn't accept either one. Now with President Trump, we already have in the first 100 days, accepting a Chinese framework, praising President Xi, causing some concern in the American human rights community. So it seems to me this book should be in translation and debated in part because of the obscurity of what's happened in the last 8 years. You're raising some really important questions that I know you won't like me to say this, but you could be helping President Trump as an indirect advisor by raising these crucial issues.
They can send him a comment.
What makes you think I already have this?
Amitai, do you have any last words of wisdom?
Very briefly. First of all, both of you have been extremely generous, and so you made my day. That's really wonderful comments. And I also think you see, we did not stack the panel. There are people who are enthusiastic about Trump, and some other people may not be. So we have the full range of views. I just want to add 2 sentences to Greg, who is one of our rising stars. A very important question about competition, and I very much agree. I think we should look at the international relations as a multi-layer cake. There are ideas we fight about, the economic system we fight about, and the military forces. One approach is what I would call total containment, in which we try to fight the other side on every possible level. We will not participate in any bank they set up. We will not allow them to participate in the TPP. We try to block them every place. They set up a Confucius Center, we're going to try and fight it. That's one way of approaching it, which maximizes tensions. I would prefer to say, in 2 of these rounds, we have no reason to fear competition ideas. Go ahead, try to sell your authoritarian capitalism. We'll try to sell our free market capitalism, and let's see which idea wins. You want to talk about Confucius? We'll talk about John Locke and
George Washington.
John Locke, and we'll see which idea wins. The same thing about economic. I don't see any reason we cannot have the more competition, the better. It's when it comes to the military there, I think we need to think about more carefully instead of confrontation, but possibly mutual restraint. So I really want to thank first Tova for putting this together, and all of you for incredible patience, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you everybody for coming. And thank you, the panelists, for a wonderful discussion. I guess it remains to be seen whether this will be a White House night.